Hi, everyone. This is Jason Bierek of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a first-time guest, but I've followed his work for a number of years on the Mises website and Mises YouTube channel with his lectures. He's a professor of economics at Pace University. He's the academic vice president of the Mises Institute. He's the author of Money, Sound and Unsound. Dr. Joseph Salerno, thank you for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Jason. Happy to be here.
Great. Yeah. And I'm excited to talk to you. I love learning about Austrian School of Economics, and many of our listeners do. But some of our listeners, even ones with large business or financial backgrounds, they don't understand the different economic schools. So what's the difference, in your opinion, between the Austrian School of Economics, Keynesian economics, monetarism, and Marxism?
Well, let's start with the Austrian school. The Austrian school begins its analysis with the individual. It focuses on the individual as the primary source of all economic activity. So the individual's choices and values are what is responsible for the network of exchanges that you see, the capital structure. I mean, if you look at New York City, that is a network of exchanges, and it has been built up over the years through interactions between individual minds based on their preferences and their expectations. So everything can be, including money, goes back to individuals. It can be explained by actions between different people. So that would be the Austrian school approach. And so that whenever you analyze a problem, you always have to focus on who is the actor, who's involved. For example, if the government imposes rent controls on the market, it's not just the government doing that. It's specific people. And they're interfering with exchanges by other specific people, in this case, the landlord and the would-be tenant. And the same thing is true with the money supply. When the government increases the money supply, it's the Austrians, more than any other school, focus on who gets the new money, because those are the people that benefit from the monetary inflation.
And what about Keynesian economics and monetarism and Marxism? How do those theories of economics differ from the Austrian school then? What are their goals then, their end games? Because they all seem to revolve around different degrees, I guess, of central planning and totalitarianism and control.
Yeah, so let's take the monetarists and the Keynesians. Both of them are what we call macroeconomic schools of thought. That is, they believe that you don't necessarily need, for various problems like the money supply and recessions, to focus on individuals, that you can just focus on these big aggregates like the money supply, total spending in the economy, aggregate demand, and things like that. That if there's suddenly total spending or aggregate demand goes up, well, then we're going to have people purchasing more, and that's going to drive the economy forward. So they're macroeconomic in that sense, that they downplay the individual's participation. But taking the Keynesians really want to plan the macroeconomic overall economy. That is, they don't want to plan in the same sense that the Marxists did. They don't want to tell everybody where to work and what goods to purchase, or they don't want to tell firms what goods to produce. But what they do want to do is to plan the total spending in the economy. So they believe that, for example, these are the Keynesians we're talking about, that consumers and investors are unreliable. They're subject to what they call animal spirits, which means that sometimes they get very optimistic and they want to spend a lot of money, and that will cause inflation. At other times, investors in particular get worried about the future, get pessimistic. So they reduce their spending on capital equipment and business structures and investing in exploring for new mines and so on. And that reduces spending in the economy. And then there's something called the multiplier effect that causes people to be laid off when they reduce spending. And those people don't have income, so they spend less. So the whole economy falls into a recession. So they want a central plan, in other words, the full amount of spending. So if consumers and investors spend too little, that's where they want the government to come in and through its central bank either to print new money or for the government itself, for the federal government itself, to begin spending more by running deficits and borrowing or printing money to pay for those deficits. So that's the Keynesian school. The monetarists, just to finish off, the monetarists basically say, well, the economy is much more stable than the Keynesians say. The spending tends to be pretty stable, but not completely. So all we have to do is have the Federal Reserve use a proper rule. So in other words, if we just allow or tell the Federal Reserve to increase the money supply at 3 to 5% per year, there shouldn't be a problem. That is, spending should grow at a normal rate, which will allow the economy to grow without going into recession. So they want to sort of just plan the money supply, whereas Keynesians are broader. They want to plan sort of all total spending.
That's interesting because, Milton Friedman, he considered himself a libertarian. And, we have a lot of these quotes that, if you gave the government all the sand in the Sahara Desert, they'd run out of sand in 5 years. So he seems to believe in markets and prices, but yet not for money. So it's kind of confusing in that sense that he seems like a libertarian in a lot of ways, except for money and things like that. So I guess that's what confuses people when people call him a libertarian, because he's not a full libertarian then, because, money is a commodity, if you've read Austrian School of Economics, and the government shouldn't be regulating it and controlling interest rates and pulling levers and things like that.
Yeah, so Milton Friedman believes that the economy itself works really well. He sort of splits it into the real economy, the microeconomy, where, workers and businesses and so on can plan on their own. But he wants to make sure that money, which is sort of off in this other compartment, is stable. Okay, he doesn't believe that money can really be part of the market economy. If you push them on it, occasionally he'll say, well, if we had a real gold standard, which we can't ever bring back, then maybe you could leave money alone. But he doesn't really, given today's situation, he didn't believe that when he was alive.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Mises also wrote a book on socialism, which I guess was his critique of Marx. And he says Marxism or socialism is not a system of economics, it's a system of redistribution. So anyone then who is in favor then of Marxist or socialist, then, they don't really believe in any type of markets and things like that. They want the government to plan everything.
Yeah, so you have to be careful. A Marxist is someone who, Karl Marx himself never wrote about socialism. He never talked about central planning. His great book was called just Capital, Das Kapital. So what he did was he just simply, his writings were oriented towards criticizing capitalism. And he never really wrote about socialism. He said it was unscientific to try to figure out what the future socialist state would look like. So the central planners who came after Marx are people who want to have pretty much all investment activities and production activities in the hands of the state. People would still be able to own their own homes and still be able to own their own clothing and personal items, but and make their decisions about those things. But all production decisions, all investment decisions will be made by the central government. And it's not necessarily even to make everyone equally well off. There's some socialists that want to do that. It's just because they believe it's more rational to have a group of people that are smarter than everyone else or wiser than everyone else to plan the entire economy. They think if you don't plan it, then it becomes chaotic or what they call anarchic.
Yeah, and I read Murray Rothbard's biography on Keynes, Keynes the Man, and he also seemed to agree with Marx on quite a bit what Rothbard was talking about. And I also read Henry Hazlitt's books, Failure of the New Economics. Keynes agreed with Marx on quite a bit, with central planning. Keynes saw that, a group of PhD central planners that were acting rationally could plan, economic investments and things like that in the economy better than, someone running their own small business or an industry or things like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. In fact, most of his disciples would deny this. They basically said, well, no, Keynes really just wanted to save capitalism from itself. He just wanted to make sure that there was sufficient spending in the economy so that we could avoid recessions. But if you look at the last few chapters of his book, what he says that in the long run, he thinks that the government should take over investment. In other words, there shouldn't be a stock market or bond market. There basically just should be government planners who are smarter than everyone else, planning what to produce. You could still have private firms, but those private firms would get the capital to invest in different things from the government. So yes, you're right. Keynes was a central planner.
Yeah, I mean, Keynes, also in Rothbard's book, Keynes the Man, he talks about how Keynes was good friends with the head of the British Fascism Party. But, I'm reading a lot of the stuff. I read the whole book there, and I also read Failure of the New Economics, too, about where Hazlitt goes line by line through general theory. Keynes, he just seems to want power and control, and he wanted to set up central banks, and he wanted inflation. This doesn't seem like someone who tended to believe that much in markets and wanted people to have savings to invest. He seems to me to be, at best, he's a fascist, but in a lot of senses, he agreed with Marx on quite a bit, whether it was Marx's labor theory of value and he didn't want wages to fall. And there are other instances there where he pretty much agreed with Marx on a lot of things.
Yeah. And basically, though, he said that when it came down to it, if there was ever a revolution, a sort of a communist revolution, he'd be on the other side of the barracks from the Marxists because he'd be on the same side as his own class. And he was part of the British elite. So he was probably fascist would fit him better than Marxist. He wanted the wiser, smarter people who are well bred and well educated to be the ones who ran the economy and ran the society itself.
My next question has to do with learning about the Austrian School. A lot of the finance people, like I said, aren't familiar with it. Even though they've gotten A in economics classes, they've only learned Keynesian. What beginners books, in your opinion, should people start reading to learn about the Austrian School of Economics before they go on to more advanced books?
Yeah, well, certainly Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. I would start with that. And then on money, Murray Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money? And then after that, I would read some of the classics. As one criticism of central planning, I would read The Road to Serfdom by Hayek, which was a bestseller in the 1940s. I think that's a very important book. And then you go on to read some of the more in-depth works like Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State. There's a few books by Mises, actually, which I would recommend. A small book called Bureaucracy, which is not just about bureaucracy. It also criticizes socialism on a very basic level. And another book by Mises, again a short book called The Anti-Capitalist Mentality. He there analyzes the types of people who oppose capitalism and the reasons why they do, which I think is also a very, very good book. And then you mentioned Keynes the Man by Murray Rothbard.
Yeah, I think it's important for our listeners to understand, that Keynes is, unfortunately, Joseph, I think Keynes is kind of worshipped as a god. The people on Wall Street, they always say, well, Keynes wouldn't have wanted things this way. But, at the end of the general theory, he talks about euthanizing the rentier, which is basically, killing off people that can't produce, that aren't productive anymore in society, people with capital and savings. He's like, they're useless to society. They shouldn't earn any investing income when the economy is bad. And that seems to me he doesn't like capitalism at all, because the whole point of capitalism, right, is to accumulate savings and profits and reinvest those into, productive activities. So it's just very and what we have now, where the interest rates have been manipulated down to zero, it seems to me that Keynes would have said, the economy is bad and we need to take the interest rates away from the rentier class. So it seems to me that Keynes, it's just frustrating with me arguing with some of these academics and Wall Street people, because I don't think they've read really the general theory and they defend it. And then, when I try to tell them that I've read Austrian School, they haven't clearly read any of these basic books that you just mentioned, and yet they bash it. I don't even know if any of them have read a single article about Austrian School of Economics that was written by someone who actually knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, you're right about that. And when you talk about euthanizing the rentier, which is what the term that Keynes used, you're right. He wanted to abolish interest. He wanted to drive it down to zero. He believed that it was an artificial. He believed that it imposed artificial scarcity on society. That we could have all the capital that we wanted without saving. We don't need saving. You just need central planners to take certain resources and allocate them to building factories and utilities and so on. So he didn't believe private savings were necessary. So at one point he talked about anyone who owned stock or something, they would be forced to turn in their stock and they would be given government bonds. And then the government could determine what interest rate to pay them, and eventually they would drive it down to zero. And that's what's happening today, right? I mean, they're
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
It's financial repression, right?
Yep.
This seems to be almost exactly what Keynes wanted, and yet we have so many people on Wall Street and the people at the Federal Reserve and the other academic Keynesians saying, well, this is not what Keynes wanted, but it seems to me it's basically exactly what he wanted.
You're absolutely right. And, I want to recommend another book, a very good book, a little bit simpler than Hazlitt's book on the failure of the new economics, and it's by Hunter Lewis, and it's called Where Keynes Went Wrong. And he compares the Austrians line by line to the Keynesians, and it's very, it was written a few years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago. It's very topical, very current. So I recommend that very highly to people on Wall Street.
Hopefully, I'll recommend some of those books. Hopefully, they'll take the time to read those. But I think, unfortunately, Joseph, they have their mind made up. And, they have a certain agenda, and Wall Street and the government get the money first. We'll talk about the Cantillon effect later. But I want to talk about the Austrian True Money Supply, which is something that you and Murray Rothbard came up with. And please tell our listeners exactly what it is, and then we'll discuss how that differs from the government inflation rates then and the CPI.
Yeah, so with the True Money Supply, Murray Rothbard and myself, we tried to come up with a statistical definition of the money supply that reflected what everyone agrees is the primary function of money, which is the general medium of exchange. And anything that's a general medium of exchange, dollars, checking accounts, and so on, can be spent immediately. So we considered them money. So we wanted to capture all the items in the American economy that were readily spendable dollars, let's put it that way. And so what we did was, differently from the official statistics, we included anything that could conceivably be spent immediately. And so we included, besides currency, Federal Reserve notes, and checking accounts at banks, we also included savings accounts at banks, because we believe that even though you can't write checks on them, you can withdraw them instantly. You can go to the bank. Nowadays, you can just go to your ATM and withdraw them or shift them over to your checking account. We also included, which was left out after the 1940s, government holds a lot of checking accounts with banks, as well as foreign governments. So those checking accounts, for some reason, didn't appear in the statistics, the money supply statistics, after World War II. So we put them back in. And then we left out things that were legitimate investments, things like certificates of deposit, where you put your money in your deposit, you get interest in return, but you cannot withdraw it before maturity. 3 months or 6 months or 12 months. And if you do withdraw it before maturity, before it matures, you are subject to penalties. You lose the interest on it, or you might even lose part of the principal. And we also left out money market mutual funds, because those are not bank deposits. Basically, you're giving your money to a manager who then invests it in very short-term, high-grade securities, things like commercial paper and so on. So that if you write a check on it, you're not really writing a check on a money market fund. You're writing it on the bank that the money market fund keeps a little bit of money at. And what they do then, if you write a $10,000 check, they'll sell $10,000 of commercial paper and so on. So we took that one out. But I want to add one other thing, that I developed this in 1986. That was when I wrote my article on it. And then a few years later, the Fed began to calculate a figure that they call MZM, which stands for money of zero maturity. So they were trying to do the same thing, and now they track that statistic. It's a little bit different from ours, but I'm not convinced that they didn't see something that Murray or myself had written on that. And it's an attempt to just capture readily spendable dollars, basically.
Yeah, I'm looking at the article on the Mises website. Now they publish the Austrian True Money Supply on the Mises website once a month. I think it's a great resource for our listeners to look at. And the M2, the line there, it's way different than the Austrian.
Right.
So when the government is saying, there was no monetary inflation, and we look at the Austrian school definition, your money supply, the TMS, it's entirely different, especially when you go back to 2009. Mm-hmm. There was an enormous difference in that. And, the government, I think, is saying, we're hearing all the people now on financial media and in Wall Street, there is no inflation. But the people on Main Street know otherwise. I mean, the monetary inflation with your TMS now, even though the money supply growth has slowed, the inflationary rate has slowed, it's still over 8% of money supply growth, according to your figures.
Yep, and whereas it's 2% lower, for example, for the official M2 money supply figure. The other thing to be pointed out is, you have to be careful of all government statistics, and ours isn't perfect, but we don't have any axe to grind. The government always wants inflation to look less than it really is, not only because it's unpopular with voters when inflation gets high, but also because they have to pay more money to Social Security beneficiaries, veterans benefits, in welfare, because the various benefits that the federal government pays out are indexed to the inflation rate. So they want to keep it looking as low as possible.
Yeah, cost of living adjustments. So they have to use another economic term, they have an incentive then to underreport inflation because they have to increase the payments.
Yep.
And they don't want to do that. And then they also have to pay the retired government employees their pension plans. They have to reinvest in things like that.
Yeah, you're right. And that's why they took housing, for example, out of the CPI back in the 1990s and put in rentals instead, because the housing prices were increasing at a much higher rate.
Yeah, and the Big Mac index, that's, with people's food bills. I mean, people on Main Street, the people we talk to, we have many tens of thousands of listeners to this podcast. And when I ask them if their bills are falling, maybe their gasoline bill has dropped in the last year or two due to the oil bust, which was, artificially credit boom, thanks to the Federal Reserve and, a fractional reserve banking. But, other than that, people's bills in the United States, the rent's not going down, their healthcare bills are going up a lot, their food bill over the last decade is up a lot. Their bills just keep going up and up, and their wages aren't rising. So that looks to me like stagflation then, where we have, more money supply chasing fewer goods or services, and there's been an enormous amount of inflation, Joseph, that's gone into the asset markets. So the people on Wall Street, the money managers I talk to who are not Austrian School, they're in complete denial that there's been any inflation in asset prices, but all I see are asset bubbles in stocks, bonds, and real estate.
Yeah, and junk bonds, new IPOs. You have billions of dollars in new IPOs. I think Peter Schiff pointed this out, and these new firms haven't earned 10 cents yet. So actually, that was Donald Trump that made that statement. So yes, you have assets blowing up all over the place.
Yeah, and the people who say that there's no inflation, the other thing I would point out is using the government's own numbers, whether it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Federal Reserve calculating this, the dollar has lost greater than 96% of its purchasing power since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. So for them to say there's no inflation now, well, look through the past. I mean, people's standard of living has been drastically eroded thanks to the massive inflation over the decades that has been created. So they can claim there's no inflation now, but look at all the inflation that's been pumped into the system over the decades.
And also that's a very good point. Inflation is actually higher than that, because really you should be measuring inflation according to what prices would have been. So there's been such a tremendous increase in productivity generated by the capitalist economy since the 1980s that prices should be going down. Not only should they not be rising like they are, they should actually be going down. So, in the case where you have a lot of increase in productivity in high definition television sets and LASIK surgery and tablet computers, you do see prices going down. But in a purely free market economy where you would have gold or silver as money, which would not be increasing very rapidly from year to year, you would find all prices, clothing, food, automobiles, they would all be going down. So that inflation is actually much higher, right? If you compared it to what prices would be without increasing the money supply at all.
Yeah, I agree. And I call this plan, part of stagflate and lie.
Yeah.
So the real economy, I think, no matter pretty much which statistics you're looking at, unless you're a computer programmer on Silicon Valley, you're not finding work, high-paying full-time jobs where your salary is going up. There's not a lot of industries like that. Maybe in oil after 2008 when the shale boom went, but now those jobs are gone with the bust. So there's so many examples to me, Joseph, where we're seeing stagflation in the real economy. The government's lying about it, and the money is just going into asset prices. So we see the stock market has gone up massive. It's basically up until the correction recently. Since 2009, it was a straight line up. And none of these things are counted as inflationary, but it's amazing that all the statistics. It's a moving target. the statistics. So you're not comparing apples to apples. It always seems like, they change the jobs numbers, they change the GDP numbers, what's included in them, they change the inflation numbers, they change the CPI. It's all head scratching, and none of this is reported to the average guy on Main Street on the mainstream, like the Wall Street Journal or CNBC or Bloomberg or anything, how the formulas are always constantly changing.
Yeah, and one other formula that they use is the hedonic adjustments, which is supposed to adjust for quality. So if your car goes up by $5,000, but it now has 4 airbags in it, whereas before it only had 2, they say, well, it didn't really go up by $5,000, went up by less than that because the quality of the car, it's more safe. So they reduce the amount of the increases in prices that they include in inflation.
I want to talk about the Austrian theory of the business cycle, which is the boom-bust cycle. That's like the quick summary of it. Why do you think Austrians are so good at predicting artificial booms and busts in advance of them actually happening?
Oh, well, I don't think they're good at timing, but I think they're good at not at exact timing for investors, but they are good, as you said, at predicting them before they happen, and it's not just random predictions. And I think the reason for that is Austrians, when they do economic theory, they start with some basic truths that human beings, for example, act in their own best interests, that they want to choose things where the benefits outweigh the costs and so on. And you can derive a body of truth from that. And in doing that, you then turn around and apply it to the real world. So you want, and I think Austrians are very good at applying, let's say, the Austrian business cycle theory. Now, what does that tell us? That basically says something like, if banks increase the amount of credit in credit markets, which then turns into an increase in the money supply, that artificially drives down interest rates. So that's a very general statement. So what Austrians do then is they look around and they say, look, the banks have been doing this since the 1990s at least, keeping interest rates artificially low. And therefore, the effects that we predicted through our reasoning will come into play after a while. And so you have to be not only a theorist but sort of an artist. You have to decide, when these effects are occurring and when they'll stop, when they'll result in a bust and so on. So I think because they have the right theory is a short answer to this. Austrians don't look at the past and try to say, oh, okay, we see all these regularities, which may not be regularities that are logical. They just may have happened, for 5 or 6 years. But Austrians try to look at universal regularities that occur again and again. And you can only get that through general reasoning.
Yeah, it was nearly impossible to time, when the real estate bubble would collapse or when the technology bubble would collapse. But Austrians saw that this artificially cheap money and credit, thanks to lowered interest rates and Federal Reserve bailouts and, all these money printing schemes, and Congress, with the subprime housing bubble, it was the Community Reinvestment Act and subprime mortgages and Wall Street creating all these mortgage derivatives. They saw that this was all easy stuff going into people who couldn't pay. So obviously it was going to be a bust because the housing prices were going up and people couldn't pay their mortgages. And we're starting to see, these credit bubbles be created, whether it's subprime auto loans now, where people can barely make the payments or at all, or they don't have to make a down payment on the car for 6 years. They're getting 0% interest and very low payments for years. Or, it's with student loan debt and things like that. So we're seeing this, or also shale oil, where now, all these shale oil companies, and there's hundreds of billions of dollars worth of loans on those. These things were all financed at $100 in oil. Well, we're more than cut in half. So, it's obvious to me that we've had big booms, artificial booms in these things. The Keynesians would say, this is all capitalism and natural market forces and things. But it's obvious, this is all based off, central planning and artificial, and this is not a real market here, and we're going to have a real correction to solve these imbalances.
Yeah, I might add that Austrians did point out that we were in a tech bubble in about 1998, 1999, and then we had the crash in 2000, 2001. And beginning in 2003, people like Mark Thornton, down to Mises Institute, and Peter Schiff, and Chris Meyer, a number of other Austrians, between 2003, 2005, insisted, and initially they were laughed at for doing this, but they insisted that we were in a housing bubble. And so it was the theory that led them to that, whereas Keynesian theory is focused on the real economy. It doesn't focus on financial markets to the same extent as Austrians do. So the case, for example, Alan Greenspan in the early 2000s said something like, "We're not in a bubble. Even if we were in a bubble, we wouldn't know that we were, and even if we knew we were in a bubble, we couldn't do anything about it." So that was what his theory led him to.
Well, I think Greenspan was a sellout. He should have known better, right? Because he had read Austrian School of Economics, and he was an Ayn Rand disciple. We also had Ben Bernanke before the subprime started to collapse. He said there is no housing bubble. Subprime is contained, and it won't spread to the rest of the economy.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, even worse was Paul Krugman, excuse me. Back in 2001, 2002, we were recovering from the 2000-2001 recession, and he said what Greenspan has to do is to start a housing bubble, drive up prices so that people can use the housing, the increase in their housing prices. They can use their homes as an ATM machine, right? Just cash out to equity loans and spend money and drive the economy into a recovery. Which is he
crazy. Claims he was joking about that in hindsight, but I don't think he was joking. I think he just said he was joking to protect his reputation. Although with me, he doesn't have a reputation, but he's obviously still, New York Times columnist, and he gets paid for speaking engagements and things like that. But yeah, you brought up a great point about how, inflation in the real economy and how Keynesians only look at falling prices and mostly consumer prices. Both von Mises and Rothbard both said the monetary inflation would first go into the capital markets. This is part of the Cantillon effect. Can you tell our listeners what the Cantillon effect is?
Yeah, the Cantillon effect was developed. At least it was mentioned in writings in the mid 1700s by an economist. Cantillon was his name, Richard Cantillon. But in any case, Mises resurrected his insight. It was a great insight that he had, and Mises pointed out that, look, if all prices went up immediately upon inflation, that is, if they all went up simultaneously, no one would benefit. So why would we have inflation? If all prices and incomes doubled immediately when the money supply doubled, nothing would change. So what he pointed out was that we have inflation because it's the people who receive the new money in it first, the government itself, and then the people who it purchases things from, government contractors, farmers that are subsidized and so on. They receive that new money before prices have risen. And as a result, they then have an increase in their real income, and they're able to spend that money and enjoy it and then divert resources away from other people who don't get the new money until later on, after prices have gone up, so that if you don't get the money for a year and you've been paying higher prices for a year, let's say 5 or 10% higher prices, then your real income has gone down by 5 or 10%. So the people who do not get the new money early in the process, or who are on fixed incomes and don't receive it at all, are the ones who lose out in the real process. Real goods and their real incomes go down, so they suffer.
Yeah, and it seems Wall Street, the banks and the government and hedge fund managers and investment banks doing yen carry trades and stuff, they're the ones getting all this free monetary inflation first. They can either borrow credit near zero because of financial repression, right, and they could put the money to work in the capital markets. Those hedge fund managers who are making, tens of millions of dollars extra in, yearly bonuses and things like that, they then spend the money into the economy. They go buy a Ferrari or Lamborghini. Right. That guy gets an extra commission, and he starts. So it seems like a trickle down effect. And I think Cantillon brought up that the prices in an real inflationary environment, they don't rise evenly. There's not an even distribution, and that's the problem. Most people think, in an inflationary environment, they see, all the prices rising evenly. I guess that's intentionally that people were mistaught about what inflation really is.
Yeah, exactly. They rise step by step. So if the government buys a new computer for guided missiles, let's say from Silicon Valley, those people get the money first. The stockholders, the skilled workers and software engineers, they then go buy more wine. They buy cars and so on. So you and I, or myself back in New York, I'm paying higher prices for wine and automobiles and steak dinners, and I might not get that new money or get the benefit of that new money for another 12 to 18 months, in which case my real income has gone down. I've had to pay higher prices for more and more goods over time.
Yeah, and my next question, I have a couple more questions, and then I'll let you go. I'm enjoying this discussion a lot, though. It has to do with deflation. We're hearing a lot of people on the mainstream, Harry Dent, a lot of people who aren't Austrian School of Economists saying, deflation is occurring now. They believe the government numbers. From an Austrian school perspective, do you think the Keynesian central bankers and the government, do you think they're going to allow real deflation to occur for a long period of time before they start further intervention?
No, never. I mean, this is, Janet Yellen, for example, in not raising interest rates, generated another excuse for not raising interest rates. Look, she's already met her target of around 5%, actually below what she said the unemployment rate should be. Inflation has gone up to near 2%. So they've met their two targets. But now there's suddenly a new target, and that is, we have to bail out China, or we have to be careful of I think she said, global developments.
Emerging markets, because their currencies have collapsed against the dollar, right, and they borrowed in dollars.
so she wants to bail them out, of course, to bail out the banks and investors that have lent to them. But it's just, no matter what happens, they're not going to stop inflating. They're going to continue to say there's reasons for a zero interest rate policy. We might even have to bring back quantitative easing and so on. So as long as they see inflation in the CPI isn't rising that much, they're going to continue doing this. What's going to bring them up short and what's going to overturn all their plans is going to be a crash on financial markets, which I see happening in the next 2 years. I mean, these bubbles are not going to be able to go on.
Yeah, either that or we're going to have a crack-up boom, too, also in the near future. I mean, we had the last couple of years, the asset prices were not rising on fundamentals in corporate profits or anything like that, and yet we had stocks, bonds, and real estate rising due to just monetary inflation that was going into the capital markets. I mean, that's basically what von Mises said with the crack-up boom would happen is, these prices would start to irrationally rise, not based on any type of normal economic activity or anything like that, but just because there was more money chasing after the same or fewer goods and services, or in this case, asset prices in the capital markets.
You're absolutely right. In fact, the financial sector since the 1980s has blown up tremendously because of government monetary policies. It's now, in a way, driving the real economy when it should be really the other way around. Right? I mean, the financial market should just be sort of subsidiary markets that are helping to allocate resources to those entrepreneurs that are best at forecasting consumer demands. But right now, it's they themselves are determining where resources are going by the irrational increases in stocks and bonds and so on.
Exactly. I completely agree with that. And, the real economy is suffering. There's a lot of small businesses out there due to Obamacare and taxes and rules and regulations and the inability to get capital because the money's being put to work in other investable assets that could grow their business. And the business person, either they can't raise the money or because of all the other taxes and rules and regulations, they don't want to invest. So it's hurting the real economy. The money's being financialized. We've seen this in the past in financial history. In the Weimar Republic, there was a big paper economy with currency speculators and things being traded back and forth before they hyperinflated. So we're starting to see evidence historically, at least from my perspective, that the economy's become way over financialized with too many people trading pieces of paper back and forth instead of real investments into real businesses creating real jobs.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And in fact, we haven't had much real capital investment since the mid-1990s. We've had a little bit because the capitalist economy continues to generate new opportunities and so on. But we've squandered it on two recessions that we've had since the mid-1990s, one of which we're still not fully recovered from. And all the capital waste that went into producing assets, real assets that should never have been produced. And so, this is where we are today. So the middle class is getting slammed by high taxes. They're getting slammed by a lack of increase in productivity that's due to the misallocation of capital that we've had in the last 20 years.
Exactly. The middle class is being grinded, like with what Lenin said, how to destroy the middle class. They're being grinded between taxes and inflation. Right. Both of them, taxes, people just pay the taxes now. A lot of people, they don't complain. The taxes are not, it's not like they're doubling, Joseph, like every year or something like that. But, over the last 10 or 15 years, people's property taxes have doubled. We hear from our listeners in many different states, whether it's New York or New Jersey. We hear how there's a lot of states now and municipalities where if you live in that area, you're paying 2% per year for the value of your vehicle. So if you're a hardworking person, good businessman, you're driving a new Mercedes or BMW, you're paying 2% per year in tax, the value of your vehicle and taxes, and all these other taxes, dozens of them are being just layered on every year. This is destroying the purchasing power and the living standards of the middle class in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely correct.
My last couple questions for you is, we've talked about what's going on in the real economy and what the Federal Reserve is doing inflationary. Why are politicians and other people in power, key influencers, why are they able to keep blaming capitalism and free markets when people like you and me look at it and say, we don't have real free markets and real capitalism?
Well, I think the reason is that people don't understand economics. I mean, that was Henry Hazlitt's point and Mises' point that the opinion leaders, the business decision makers and even professionals and so on have to be taught economics. We as Austrians have to short circuit the media. The media misleads people. The establishment media, fortunately, it's being undercut by the internet and so on, other sources of information. But I think that the job of economic educators and Austrians who want to be economic educators, people like yourself, is to get around the message given by the media, which is always pro-government, bigger government, more intervention in the economy, and also this harping on the inequality of income that's caused by the economies, by capitalist economies. So just when one thing dies off, let's say workers being exploited, you have something else. Well, now the land is being exploited, and we have the potential of an environmental catastrophe. And now that people are losing interest in that, and seeing climate change just as another natural phenomenon, now there has to be something else, and that is this terrible income inequality that we have. So go ahead.
There's a lot of Marxism in the culture, and they're not using the normal words that Marx and other of his disciples used in the past, like proletariat and bourgeoisie. The phrases have been changed to more softer ones, like the poor, and we have gender wars that are being created, and we have class warfare that's being created. And it all seems, like the people in power are dividing and conquering intentionally so they can maintain power, and the people on the ground, the people on Main Street, they're fighting with each other, not understanding where the real problems are coming from in society.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. In other words, the government keeps fractionating the economy, factionalizing it, making up more stories about who is exploiting whom, when in fact there's only two classes in the economy, and that is the people who live off their production and exchange, which is voluntary, and those that then are parasitic and suck away all of the income and wealth that is produced by people who exchange and live voluntarily.
Exactly. So I think, this Marxism has become culturally pervasive. It's been planted in Hollywood and the mainstream media. I mean, objective journalism in the mainstream media, whether it's Fox or CNN or MSNBC, it's gone. People are just slanted. They report. They're not even willing to, if there's a book that comes out arguing about an exact opposite opinion, people aren't even willing to challenge their own beliefs anymore. They have their mind made up because they read something from their favorite website that they only look at. They're just so biased or late or lazy or too busy or tired, and they believe what they want to believe now. It's just propaganda and mind control, unfortunately, and it's very subtle in a lot of aspects.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I think central planning definitely doesn't work, whether it's Marxism or Keynesianism. We're seeing the effects of that, the end game of Keynesian economics. But, the U.S. is headed, unfortunately, we're seeing this with Bernie Sanders and so many other politicians. The U.S. is headed towards a European socialism type of path. Maybe I'm trying to wake people up. I know you are on the Mises channel. But, all of these things, Joseph, whether there's the cashless society, which you've talked about recently as well, or financial repression, or Keynesian economics, they're all symptoms of totalitarianism. So, the stuff with Edward Snowden with the NSA control, and all these different things are all different symptoms of totalitarianism, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think the economic part of it, the economic totalitarianism, is a big building block in that structure that they're aiming at, which is total control. And so controlling the economy is a key, and that's what we as Austrians have to oppose tooth and nail.
Yeah, and Mises, one of his main life goals was fighting socialism and fighting totalitarianism. So hopefully we're trying to follow along that path. It's not an easy path, though. There's not a lot of people in the financial community who are willing to, work with me. It's tough to get a lot of mainstream money managers on, billionaires. I've had them commit to coming on a podcast here, and then they look up that I like gold and know the Austrian School, and they don't want tough questions.
Yeah, but I mean, you can get lower level people from Wall Street, right? The people who lived through the last crash and bust of the bubble, and are still in a way that's genuine, looking for answers. So I think the financial crisis put us in a situation where there are smart people out there, even on Wall Street, even in banks, that are looking for reasons why this happened. And if we have another crisis, which I think is coming in the next few years, I think this is going to even drive more people to our side and to our point of view. And we have to be ready to educate them.
Yeah, that's actually how I woke up. I didn't have any business or financial background, and I was a stockbroker in training, a registered investment advisor at a larger firm, not on Wall Street, but a larger financial firm. And, the 2008 crash happened, and my parents lost a lot of money during the stock market crash then. They also lost a lot of money during the technology boom. And I was like, what the heck is going on here? I want answers for what really happened. And the stuff I was hearing on TV from CNBC and Bloomberg, it didn't make any sense to me. They kept repeating a lot of times, no one saw this coming and stuff like that. And I was like, someone has to see this coming. Someone had to understand that this pressure was building up, and it just exploded at a point. Maybe they didn't know the exact timing, but they saw in advance that bad things were going to happen at some point.
Right.
Well, Joseph, I really enjoyed our discussion today. I definitely want to have you back on in the future. Keep up the great work. Please tell our listeners where they can find your articles and your speeches and also your writing. Okay,
so almost all of my articles, speeches, lectures, and so on are all up on Mises.org, www.mises.org, which is the website of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. So you can find everything there.
Great. And have a good weekend, and thank you again for your time. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Okay, Jason, thank you, and thank you for having me on.